to make all necessary preparations for the use of chemical warfare from the outbreak of war.
Chemical clouds of gas or smoke are heavier than air. They roll along the ground, filling woods, valleys, trenches, and dugouts.
There are all these memos back and forth about what they're doing, and there's a memo signed by General Douglas MacArthur about under what conditions we would use chemical warfare against the British. And basically the conditions were, if we don't have a treaty with them, precluding it. Well, okay, we're not going to gas these 5 million guys unless it's perfectly legal.
And then came the Great Depression.
To make matters even worse, the world economy was teetering on the edge of an abyss.
Looking at these war plans, it's a very dark spirit of the age in the early 1930s.
We were wrestling with the worst depression in our history. Some of us were out of jobs. Some of us stood in bread lines. Some of us suffered homemade aggression. Some of us were choked with dust. Some of us had no place to go.
I think that had some capacity to color these plans. At the very least, war seemed more possible after 1930 than it had in the 20s. War Plan Red is a dismal war. Much of the war planning is built on strategic bombing of cities. In the war plan itself, it says industrial centers. Well, what's an industrial center? It's Albany, it's Toronto, right? So a central part of the war plan is blue and red, meaning, Britain and Canada and the United States bombing each other's cities.
So by 1935, there had been massive military maneuvers, money was being sought for secret air bases, and authorization was granted for the use of poisonous gas. But as Peter Carlson discovered, behind the scenes, the Americans were also conducting cloak and dagger operations.
March 26, 1935, subject military reconnaissance. Colonel Charles A. Lindbergh, there's a famous name, flew to and was present at Port Churchill on the west shore of Hudson Bay from August 1st to the 3rd, 1931. No written report of his conclusions as to the practicability of that area for seaplane work is available. Looks like they're willing to send Lindbergh over to spy, but they don't really want to start a war. Well, Lindbergh is the first guy to fly the Atlantic in 1927. 4 years later, in 1931, he's on this shadowy mission, presumably from the American Army, to scout out the possibilities of using seaplanes along the Canadian border.
What gives this special resonance is that Lindbergh, the all-American hero, was also a keen supporter of the burgeoning Nazi movement in America.
He kind of got a little palsy-walsy with the Germans, the Nazis, to put it bluntly, and was a leader in the America First movement, which was sort of quasi-pro-German or neutralist.
I pledge.
This shocking footage shows Nazi rallies taking place in the heart of America during the 1930s.
The States of America as a republic for which it stands, one nation, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Was it the case that Lindbergh and the other American Nazi sympathizers thought Hitler would support them in a war against the British? It turns out Hitler thought war between Britain and America was inevitable. But if American Nazis thought Hitler would aid them against Britain, they were barking up the wrong tree. Hitler wanted war between Britain and America, but amazingly, he wanted the British to win. He thought that would be the best outcome for Germany.
Hitler looked back at the history of the British Empire, very ruthlessly striking down its rivals one after another to, secure its global dominance. And Hitler looked at the British, and his assumption was that the British still had this in them, that this was something that they were still capable of. So, for him, it was just a perfectly natural thing to assume that the British would view the Americans through the same sort of lens, this sort of Darwinistic lens that Hitler himself used, and that he could work with the British potentially against the United States.
Hitler was convinced the British would act as they always did when faced by a newly emerging power: war. By this logic, to Hitler, a conflict between Britain and America seemed inevitable.
Britain, during the 18th century, emerged as the world's superpower as a consequence of a series of wars fought against rivals, against Spain, against the Netherlands, against France. In the 20th century, Britain faced the rise of Imperial Germany and the United States, two rising powers. This situation looks very similar to what had happened in the past, and all the ingredients were there for another major war. Indeed, one of the great stories to tell in the 20th century is why didn't war break out between Britain and the United States when there are so many other examples of these wars occurring between rising and declining powers?
With the world in turmoil and centuries of conflict between Britain and America, Plan Red was starting to look like a realistic military option. In the next part, we'll see how the plan would have played out and who would have won if it had ever been put into action. Plan Red was developed by the American military in the early 1930s for war against the British Empire. At the start of the plan, the Americans laid out their goals. They planned to eliminate all British Empire land forces in North America, as well as naval forces in the North Atlantic. They would then extend their control across the world's oceans to destroy British trade and bring her to the point of economic exhaustion. The question is, would they have succeeded? To find out, we've gathered military experts from the three main countries affected by the plan. In Canada, we are at the Royal Military College in Kingston, Ontario. This is the main officer training facility for Canada's armed forces. In the UK, we are at the Joint Services Defence Academy in Shrivenham, which is where senior officers learn how to fight major wars. And in the US, we are at the Naval War College in Newport, Rhode Island. Much of the original work on Plan Red was done here.
Well, here's Pringle Hall, where the wargaming took place. And they would fight the battles here on the floor. And then there were balconies around the gaming floor so that observers could watch what was going on.
Well, John, they still have an adequate map to give us a strategic picture of Plan Red. The plan doesn't really tell you how the war starts. It does say, though, that the British will be sneaky and will try and, before the outbreak of hostilities, sneak reinforcements to the possessions of theirs in the Caribbean, like Jamaica and Bermuda. The war begins, however, and the first thing the U.S. does is, from Boston, takes 3 Army divisions, 25,000 men. That doesn't seem very much, but there you have it, screened by the fleet on M+3 assault on Nova Scotia.
This assault on Halifax, Nova Scotia, was key to how the whole war would develop. Yet the Americans hoped to launch the attack just 3 days into the war.
If the Americans take Halifax, they've cut the Atlantic off from the British. They have created a situation where the heart of Canada, between Montreal and Quebec, is also cut off.
This was a bold move, but hard to pull off in such a short time. During World War II, the Allies discovered that successful amphibious landings took months to organize. This attack on Halifax was unrealistic and would have failed. Britain would still be able to bring reinforcements to Canada and would retain a naval base on the American side of the Atlantic.
From Halifax, the British can blockade and force the U.S. fleet, if it doesn't give battle, to move farther south.
The Americans reckoned that if their assault on Halifax failed, Britain would have a naval task force and 8 army divisions in Halifax within 30 days. Faced with this prospect, the Americans needed to mobilize, and fast.
The second major element of the plan is to form a giant field army here to drive north into the heart of Canada.
This army would be used to launch 4 attacks. One of these would come from the Fort Drum area up towards Ottawa and Toronto. A second would strike the Great Lake border crossings near Buffalo and Detroit. A third would head north into the center of Canada around Winnipeg, an attack that would cut Canada in half. And a final assault on the western seaports around Vancouver would stop the British bringing in forces via Australia and India.
It's a pretty neat plan, and it doesn't waste any effort trying to invade here. It does talk about seizing bridgeheads here at Sault Ste. Marie, at Detroit, and also here at Niagara Falls, so that the Canadians can't attack these major U.S. industrial centers and at the same time keep the flow of goods going in the Great Lakes. So there'll be a battle for naval supremacy in the Great Lakes again.
Plan Red is unclear about how quickly America would launch these assaults, but it does lay out their worst fears about how many troops Britain could bring to the war if they gave her enough time to get organized.
A year into it, the Brits have 2.8 million guys, and the Canadians have 649,000, so there's 3.5 million British Empire guys fighting us somewhere around Winnipeg, presumably, or Halifax. 3 million people. We would presumably have an equal number, and it would be like the Battle of Verdun. That would have been fun.
The assumption was that every British troop, every British reservist, and every soldier anywhere throughout the empire, in Australia, New Zealand, India, that these forces could be very quickly mobilized and transported to Canada and would be able to undertake a massive and prolonged land war against American forces.
If that happened, the war could easily become a bloody stalemate. So the Americans thought speed was of the essence. Ideally, they needed to mount their attack on Canada within the first 6 months of the war, before Britain could organize significant reinforcements. On paper, it looked as if the Americans had every chance of success. But the outcome would depend on how Canada responded. The Americans wouldn't have had it all their own way. Canada had a plan of her own, called Defense Scheme Number 1.
The key to it was to move quickly. I mean, the key really was to strike at the Americans before the mobilization process could get very far progressed.
The idea was go south, hold ground, and then stage a fighting withdrawal where you just destroyed everything that would slow the American advance north.
Well, the overall strategy of Defense Plan Number 1 had like 3 or 4 essential elements. The first was to move south from Vancouver towards Seattle and Portland, Oregon, and then, if they could, Spokane, further in this region, and try to control this region there.
That's right. And then from the prairies, the idea was to strike south across the border towards Fargo, North Dakota, and then, if all went well, would have tried to move on to Minneapolis.
There would be an offensive along the east coast of Lake Ontario. Canadian forces would move from somewhere in this region, maybe at the forces base at Kingston, south to the Mohawk River down to Albany, New York, and I suppose, if possible, New York City.
This wasn't an invasion. These were raids. The plan was to push as far into the USA as possible, then fall back, blowing up bridges and railways as they went. It was all designed to slow the Americans down, and the plan was the brainchild of one extraordinary Canadian officer, Brigadier James Sutherland Buster Brown.
My father was director of operations and intelligence of the Canadian Army. As soon as he developed the scheme, he needed more information, and so he carried out reconnaissance, and this was characterized as being spies.
Here it is, three men in their 40s. Workingman's cap looks like Andy Capp, sitting on a fence.